Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Gran. I'm Director of the Middle East Studies Center here at Portland State University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. The talk that you're about to hear is the keynote address for an academic conference on minorities in the modern Middle East. The Middle East Studies Center is bringing together scholars from around the world to discuss a topic which has been attracting renewed interest in the field of Middle East studies. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the workshop participants and discussants, and warm thanks to the conference organizers, Professor Yasmin Hanoush of the Department of World Languages and Literatures, and my colleague in the History Department, Professor Laura Robson. I'm grateful for the generous support of a number of co-sponsors here at Portland State University, including the Departments of History and World Languages and Literatures, the Portland Center for Public Humanities, the Portland State University Speakers Board, and the Internationalization Mini-Grant Program. Finally, special thanks to the staff at the Middle East Studies Center and to PSU staff and volunteers who are here this evening helping to make sure that things run smoothly. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for the evening, Professor Juan Cole. He is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. Professor Cole is a scholar of truly wide-ranging interests. He has written extensively on the political, social, and religious history of the modern Middle East and larger Muslim world. Among his numerous publications, his most recent historical study is entitled Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East. Alongside his distinguished record of scholarship, Professor Cole has also produced some of the most incisive commentary on the contemporary Middle East and Muslim world. Many of you are already familiar with him. He frequently appears on television and radio, and he writes a widely read and influential blog called Informed Comment. He has a great deal of personal experience, having lived and worked in various parts of the Muslim world for nearly 10 years and continues to travel there widely. His most recent book of analysis and commentary, examining the relationship between the West and the Muslim world today, is entitled Engaging the Muslim World. Following his lecture this evening, Professor Cole will have time to respond to a few questions. I would ask that you keep your questions brief and that you phrase your remarks as questions. Professor Cole's talk tonight is entitled Minorities and the Arab Revolutions. Please join me in welcoming Juan Cole to Portland State University.
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be here in Portland. Despite the very strange atmospheric disturbance of this big yellow ball in the sky, I'm sure you're quite disturbed by that, but I'm very pleased to have been invited to kick off this very interesting conference on minorities. And my charge this evening, I suggested talking about the issue of minorities and the revolutions that began sweeping the Arab world in 2011. Because those revolutions challenged long-standing institutions and institutional arrangements in politics, they inevitably also had an impact on the position of minorities. And I'm going to start with Egypt, where Coptic Christians form, it is said, 10% of the population. And I don't know of a place in the Middle East that has a proper census of these things. There was one done in Lebanon in 1931, but apparently it's too touchy to be succeeded by another any time in the last century. And so we don't really know the percentage, and you see other I mean, some people say 6%, some people say 10% and so forth. But let's say it's 10%. There's a kind of veil of tears narrative about minorities in the Middle East. They're oppressed, and they're in a largely Muslim society, and they're looked down upon and they're discriminated against, which is largely true. It's not fun to be a minority in any society. But I want to push back against that narrative a little bit, because I think it sometimes is a narrative that's taken up by partisans of various sorts. So you see missionary societies are very into that narrative, or people who have an axe to grind of various sorts. It forms, I think, a false impression to some extent of the position of, say, the Copts in Egypt. And so you often hear that, they're about to disappear. So, and there was a missionary who spread a story that after Mubarak fell, 100,000 Copts left Egypt. I don't think that's probably true, by the way. But even if it were, let's look at it in a different way. I'm a historian, and I'm a social historian, so I'm interested, pardon me, in large social groups, and sometimes I bring in numbers. So in 1850, population of Egypt was on the order of 4.5 million. And as far as we know, the Copts' percentage in the population has been about stable for the last couple hundred years, so that would mean 10% of the 4.5 million were Copts. So that would be 450,000 in 1850. Egypt is one of the more remarkable growth stories, population-wise, in the world, because by 1900 there were 11 million, and by 1950 there were 20-some million. By 1980 there were 42 million, and today we think there are 84 million. So there are many more Egyptians than there used to be. And 10% of them nowadays would be over 8 million. So does that look to you like the Copts are disappearing? I mean, in any other context, wouldn't that be a success story, numbers-wise? So this idea that, they're persecuted and they're all leaving and they don't exist anymore. So, actually, you could tell a different story, which is that the Christians of the Middle East in the mid-19th century were second-class citizens under the Ottoman Empire. Now they're increasingly social and political actors in increasingly democratic states and playing political roles, that they're much more important now than they were in 1850. Rather than a decline narrative, you could tell an ascension narrative. And that's what I would argue for. And I'd just point out that, I don't keep up with the demographic statistics in Europe all that well, but last I knew there were about 10 million Greeks. So the number of Christians in Egypt is getting on towards being the number of Christians in Greece. So we don't think about, well, that's a bad example. I was going to say we don't think about Greece disappearing, but don't think about Christianity in Greece disappearing, at least. And then, there are very, very wealthy Coptic businessmen. The Soares family is billionaires. When I was in Egypt, I've known Copts who were high-powered attorneys, shopkeepers, retailers. Yes, Christians are disproportionately poor in Egypt. There are Christians living in slums. And the famous Shobra slum that I'll tell you about is about 50% Christian. So they're like a minority in any other part of the world. They suffer some disabilities from being a minority. But on the other hand, They're not disappearing. They have successes. They have an influence in society. And yes, they're facing some real challenges nowadays, but they're doing so in very interesting ways. And I was in Egypt. I've gone to Egypt in each of the last few years, and I have been studying social movements around these Arab revolutions. And among the ones I've been hanging out with have been Coptic organizations, and some of them have been pro-revolutionary Coptic organizations, and they have their own YouTube feed and their own media, and they do election observing and so forth. So I just want to begin by saying that I don't dispute some of the elements of the Veil of Tears narrative that they're oppressed minorities, but I want to push back against that and say they are social agents and political agents of their own kind. Now, the authoritarian governments that dominated the Middle East in the post-World War II period most often arose as responses to a long period of European colonialism and European dominance. So they were nationalistic, often military regimes. They were authoritarian, and they had a rhetoric of national unity. In that kind of rhetoric, the Copts in Egypt were configured as Egyptian nationals, and it was kind of gauche to bring up about them being a minority. They were all Egyptians together in that discourse. And because these were authoritarian regimes, they didn't necessarily have a lot of grassroots support. Sometimes some leaders were very popular. And Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was a very popular leader. You can't doubt that if you see the crowds that came out to hear his speeches and so forth. But in other times and places, as with his successors, Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak, sometimes they weren't so popular. But they were still authoritarian. They ran police states. It wasn't to the extent of East Germany or anything, but there were aspects of that. Sometimes, people were arrested arbitrarily. They were tortured. Some groups were not allowed, the Muslim Brotherhood and some other, and leftists were often jailed. So the Copts were sometimes held up as an example of why you need an authoritarian secular regime. The Coptic Christians need to be protected from Muslim fundamentalists, from irredentist factions, and therefore it's good that you have a dictator. It's a benevolent dictatorship, and it's looking out for the interests of this minority. And then, this argument was used for lots of groups. So likewise, women. The regime would say, you think the Muslim Brotherhood is going to give you feminist sorts of rights? I mean, the regime did not give women feminist sorts of rights, but it posed that way. And it actually took up the space for women's activism in doing so. There was this argument that the Copts were being protected by the regime, which, let us be frank, did appeal especially to some middle-class urban Copts. But it wasn't persuasive to the entire community. And there were deep resentments in the Coptic community towards the Mubarak regime on a number of grounds. And so when the revolution came in January and February of 2011, there was significant Coptic participation in the demonstrations and in the anti-regime activities. What were their grievances against Mubarak, who claimed to be their great protector? Well, first of all, they minded, being held up as kind of tokens for the regime. And then the regime wasn't always very nice to them. So the very working class, kind of slum-dwelling Christians are almost like a caste. I mean, I've lived in India, and these reminded me almost of a caste. Of course, they only marry within themselves. And they have distinctive occupations. So in Islam, as in Judaism, pork is forbidden, but the Christians eat pork. And so the Christians raised swine for themselves inside the community. And especially the lower class Egyptians would forage their pigs in public spaces. So, they would engage in a kind of commons sort of activity of using public grass and public kinds of goods to feed their swine, or not grass, but even garbage. And that was another thing that these very working class Christians did, which was that they were the garbage collectors. They weren't, nobody appointed them garbage collectors. So it wasn't like they had a uniform or a pension or health benefits. They just kind of volunteered to collect the garbage. But everybody that I knew of in Cairo depended on them, and I did myself. They're called zabbals, and they perform an extremely important service. In some ways, they are the great recyclers of Egyptian society. So they'll gather up plastics and recycle them, and then they would feed some of the garbage to their pigs and so forth. Well, when the swine flu thing came along, the Egyptian government never really liked them raising pigs, I think, and had sort of latent Muslim prejudices against that. But there also grew up a kind of conspiracy theory hysteria that the pigs might spread swine flu. And so they killed them. There was this mass slaughter of thousands of these Christian pigs, which were their capital. So and then a lot of them no longer had a reason to collect garbage because they were feeding it to their pigs and so forth. And so the garbage collection declined. And since the government didn't bother to have a garbage collection service, it made Cairo even dirtier. And so, among lower class Christians, they were furious at this regime. And then, occasionally there would be attacks on Copts or on churches. Some of these happened in the rural areas. There are a lot of Coptic Christians in Upper Egypt, towards Sudan. And in that area, many of them are landlords and they have property. And so they're engaged in kind of Hatfield and McCoy sort of feuds with the Muslim landlords. And sometimes this breaks out into fighting. It's always interpreted in the West as persecution of Christians. Sometimes it's not exactly that. It's more of a property dispute. But occasionally it is persecution, or there are Salafi Muslims, the very, very hardline Muslims who kind of look to Saudi Arabia for their cues as to religious piety, who sometimes will attack Christian churches or Christians. But there was a suspicion in the Coptic community that the Mubarak regime let these things happen time to time, maybe even had foreknowledge of it and didn't intervene, or sometimes that it was actually a government operation, that it was a false flag attack, because the regime could then come in and say, we're protecting the Copts against the fanatical Muslims and authorize its own dictatorship. In this way. So in early January of 2011, there was a bombing at the main Coptic cathedral in Alexandria, the major Egyptian city up on the Mediterranean. And it seems to me from the press reports and from talking to people that maybe a majority of Copts were absolutely convinced that the Mubarak secret police was behind this. And it was at a time of increased tension and the building of this revolution. So, as I said, when the revolution broke out, the young people, especially people on the left of center, this revolution, in its initial stages at least, in the great crowds in Tahrir Square in downtown Cairo and elsewhere in Egypt, was staged by activist youth whose parents, I think, had been in some faction of the left. But these youth were not interested in factions or parties, and they were using Facebook and the internet to network with one another. And between them and other groups, including the more activist Muslim youth, but it was really led by the left of center youth. It was a very Portland kind of revolution, and it drew in then many people from the larger society over time. And the Christians were amongst them. So when they went to Tahrir Square, it's illegal to have a big sit-in in the center of the city. They were blocking traffic. They put up tents. They were staying overnight. This was a scandal, young people sleeping out. And who knows what they got up to. And the government even started instituting virginity tests of the women protesters as a way of slamming their honor that they were sleeping out in tents and protesting. And there was some danger that the secret police, the Amna Dawla, the state security services, would attack these crowds. And there's 70,000, 100,000, 150,000 people coming out at this time in January. And they were starting to be besieged by the security forces. Not so much the army. The army was there, it came, it's watched, but the army more or less declared itself neutral. Sort of, this is interesting, let's see what happens. But the secret police were the regime types, and they were attacking. And one major attack, which became famous because they brought in some of the camel drivers from the pyramids who were angry at having lost all their tourists because of this revolution. And the day of the camel, they rode down on the protesters and so forth. But at a moment when there was some danger of secret police intervention, the young people in Tahrir Square who felt very besieged heard one morning that a vast crowd was marching to support them, and that they were coming from Shobra, from this slum. And they came down walking, it must have been a couple hours, and across October the 6th bridge into Tahrir Square to give support. So these Shobra people were a completely different social class than the young people who began the revolution. They were like you guys. The original protesters, they were college students and white-collar people and so forth. And they were using Facebook. And I don't know how many Facebook users there were in Shobra. But now the working class people, were coming. Maybe their parents were garbage collectors, or they worked in a factory, and half of them are Christian, right? So I did interviewing, and one of the young people told me they saw when they could see an October 6th bridge, people were coming towards them. They could see the glint of the crosses around the girls' necks, and they had this moment of just weeping, and they couldn't believe that the people of Shobra had come to support their revolution. So there was that enthusiasm in some quarters of the Coptic community. And after the Mubarak government fell, the first thing that happened was that the military then made a coup. So the first achievement of the Egyptian revolution was a military coup. That wasn't what they were going for. But, and a lot of the activists were very unhappy about it. But it was universally held that after Mubarak, what should happen should be free and fair, transparent parliamentary elections. And this is another big change that happened in the region in the past, I would say, 15 years. Is that this generation, the millennials, the people born in the 80s and 90s, they think normal politics is parliamentary politics. The old Leninist model that had prevailed in the East Bloc and in much of the Arab world had no appeal to them. And of course, it had collapsed in 1989 through 1991. So when they came to political consciousness, it was already ancient history. And so there was no question among any of them that what after Mubarak? Elections, parliamentary rule, democracy. And this was very striking to me because, I started going to the Middle East back in the early 70s, and I knew their parents when they were young, and nobody was talking about bourgeois democracy as the ultimate goal of anything at that time. They wanted a man on horseback, and they wanted revolution and so forth. But these young people wanted a democracy, and then the military didn't step in to say we're going to permanent rule. They said we're going to preside over a transition to parliamentary elections, which they did. The young people did more demonstrations, kind of held their feet to the fire about it, but the military didn't renege on that promise. In the fall 2011 run-up to these parliamentary elections, of course, there was campaigning and there were tensions, and this was the first time in Egyptian history that you had not an election, because the Mubarak regime, like the East Bloc, had regular phony elections in which the ruling party always won comfortably. But it was the first time that the outcome was in doubt. It was the first time that there was something really at stake. And there was another one of those incidents in Upper Egypt in October of 2011, where Salafis, very hardline, more fanatical Muslims attacked a Coptic family that was planning to build a church. And there was kind of a storefront church, as I understand it, which was attacked as well. The Copts in Cairo were very upset about this because it was martial law, and the military was supposedly in control. So they said, how could this happen unless the military is letting it happen? In a martial law situation, you can't have people attacked in this way unless the military is somehow complicit in this. And so they very bravely came out and made a big demonstration in front of the television, the state-owned television station in downtown Cairo called the Maspero district. And if they suspected that the military didn't like them very much, their suspicions were confirmed because the military really minded this Coptic demonstration, and it's not entirely clear what happened, but whether it's local police and soldiers and commanders became over-enthusiastic about curbing this demonstration, but they opened fire and they killed about 30 people. And it was a kind of massacre. And the Copts were absolutely furious. In the aftermath, they made more demonstrations and they accused the military of sentiments against them. And they joined in then with the leftist youth, and ironically enough, at that point, de facto, not in any overt way, but de facto, they got on the same side as the Muslim Brotherhood, because the question at that time was, how quickly did you want the military to go back to the barracks? How quickly did you want a transition? And the Copts, because of what happened at Maspero, were on the side of a quick transition. And so were the Muslim Brotherhood and the leftist youth. So there was a kind of very odd set of bedfellows arguing for this against the military. The military didn't go back to the barracks, but it did, and the parliamentary elections that it held were roundly won by the Muslim parties, by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, and the secularists didn't do nearly as well, although they did respectably. And the Copts were very upset by this outcome, especially by the good showing of the Salafis, who were, the Muslim Brotherhood has been in Egyptian politics for a long time. It was founded in 1928. It was proscribed for a long time. Early in its career in the 40s and early 50s, it engaged in political violence. But it gave that up in the 70s in a kind of grand bargain with the state, and it began running candidates in the parliamentary elections, not under its own banner, but under other party banners. And the Muslim Brotherhood developed a discourse of civil politics. So whatever they thought about Coptic Christians, the Muslim Brotherhood typically wouldn't openly slam them. They would have a discourse that we're all Egyptians and we should find a way to live together. And yes, we want a more Islamic kind of state, but the Coptic rights will be preserved and so forth. The Salafis, on the other hand, are the new kids on the block. It's likely, it's not entirely clear, but it's likely that a lot of them or their parents had lived in Saudi Arabia as guest workers. From the oil boom of the 1970s until now, millions of Egyptians have spent at least some time as guest workers in the Gulf, and including a lot of them in Saudi Arabia. And so, the Egyptian Sunni Islam is not radical, but a Saudi way of doing Islam is, I struggle for words to describe it because it's not more conservative, because that implies that it's more true to Islam. And I don't want to it's none of my business who's more true to Islam. But I would say that it's certainly more narrow-minded. I don't know if that's a good social science term. Saudi Islam, there's no churches in Saudi Arabia. Even Qatar, which is another Wahhabi state, allows churches, but not in Saudi Arabia. And women don't drive in Saudi Arabia, and so on. You can go on and on. There's kind of morals police that beat you if you don't go pray when the prayer time comes, and so forth. So I don't know what you want to call that. Fanatical seems to me, not a nice social science term in the sense of being objective, but I can't think of good words that convey what I want to say without seeming to denigrate the object of study. And Egyptian Sunnis, don't have a problem with people having churches and having church ceremonies and so forth. In fact, in Alexandria, there were middle-class Egyptian families who in some ways joined in the celebrations of Christmas. But in Saudi Arabia, so these young Egyptians who worked as guest workers in Saudi Arabia and came back, brought back a very Saudi kind of Wahhabi framework. And when they emerged into politics, starting really in the last 10 years, they didn't restrain themselves in their public rhetoric. So, they would shout, "You guys are all going to hell because you're not proper Muslims." And they felt that way about the Muslim Brotherhood. It wasn't just like Christians, but anybody who wasn't like them was condemned. And they would say these things publicly. They would call people kuffar or infidels. And it was a very different kind of public political and religious rhetoric that Egyptians were used to hearing inside their own country. And very upsetting to the Copts. So when the Salafis they got about 24% of the seats in the Egyptian parliament. The Copts were really freaked out. That's another social science term. Then the courts intervened to prorogue parliament on the grounds that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis had broken the rules of the election. About a third of the seats had been set aside for independents, and parties weren't supposed to run candidates in those constituencies, but the Muslim parties did. So the Supreme Court said the whole parliament has to be dissolved and you have to have new elections. They still haven't had the new elections. So the next big problem for the Copts was poor Egypt, in its post-revolutionary phase, it's been given often the worst possible configuration of choices, but there was a first round of presidential elections in which there were 14 candidates, but there were 5 major ones. And they all the 5 major ones kind of split the vote, 20%, 25%. And several of those candidates were pretty good guys and would have been good presidents for Egypt. But the 2 worst candidates won. Again, this is a biased way of putting it. Let us say the two most polarizing candidates came to the fore. Ahmed Shafiq, who was an Air Force general, and had been Hosni Mubarak's last prime minister, got enough votes to get into the runoff in June of 2012 for the presidency. This is really quite remarkable in a post-revolutionary society. It would be, I don't know, like the French had a choice between the king and Robespierre in 1792. You know, there was still, you know, a contest there, but Shafiq, you know, there were a lot of middle-class Egyptians who were very afraid of what might happen to Egypt, and they held their nose. They didn't much like Shafiq, who is sometimes accused of being corrupt and was identified with the old regime. So they held their nose and voted for him. And the Copts, you know, willy-nilly were forced to mostly support Shafiq. His opponent was Mohammed Morsi, a Muslim Brotherhood leader. He was trained in the United States. He's an engineer, and he, however, was associated with the conservative wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, because there were a lot of fights inside the Muslim Brotherhood in the 90s and zeros. There was kind of a young, more liberal faction of the party, but Morsi was from the one that opposed that faction. He was the conservative. So you have this contest between a regime holdover from the antediluvian period and the Muslim Brotherhood candidate. And the Muslim Brotherhood candidate barely won. And this tells you something, because he was running against Mubarak's last prime minister. Shafiq at one point said that Mubarak was like a father to him. Even if that were true, if you were running for president of Egypt after angry mass crowds of millions of people had chased him out of the country, would you say that publicly? But even then, he barely lost. I mean, Morsi won by 3 percentage points. But now this is another kind of challenge for the Copts, that they're going to have a Muslim Brotherhood president. And the president is now in a position to shepherd through the writing of the Egyptian constitution, which there had already been a committee established by the old parliament to make the constitution. And there were Salafis on that committee and a lot of Muslim brothers, because the parliament was dominated by those two groups. And the left liberals felt like they were only 20% of it and were consistently outvoted or outrun. So Morsi, once he became president, seems to have really had paranoid fantasies that he was going to be overthrown at any moment, that there would be a counter-revolution, that the old regime elements, because, you know, it was just Mubarak that left. It wasn't the officer corps or the bureaucrats or the judges or the television anchors. They were all still the old regime. It was only the top of the regime that was lopped off, you know, and some of the cabinet ministers and cronies of the regime were prosecuted. But for the most part, Morsi as president is president of a bureaucracy that hates him. And he's afraid that the officers and the judges are going to collude to strike down his election the same way they had struck down the election of the Muslim Brotherhood parliament, or make a counter-revolution of some sort. And Morsi is not a very good politician. He could have, I think, gone to the people with these concerns. He could have gone to Tahrir Square and said, "Oh, Egyptians, our revolution is in danger from, you know, military irredentism and from these old Mubarak-era judges. They're going to make a counter-coup. They're going to bring back Mubarak. You have to come and support me." And I think he would have gotten enormous support if he had done that. Instead, he comes out on television and he says, "Well, I'm above the law." The judges can't strike down anything I do. Well, he said this because he was afraid that they might make a counter coup against him, but the way he did it made him look like, Mubarak, son of Mubarak part deux. So the leftist youth and the liberals all got very angry at him, started making demonstrations and in huge numbers, and they attacked he had to run away from the presidential palace, and people said, we just can't accept this decree that you're above the law. And then Morsi felt he needs some kind of other institution besides the presidency if the government is going to maintain itself in the face of opposition from the judges, from the officer corps, from the street. And so he decides, there were two houses of parliament. There's an upper house, the Majlis Ashura, or the Constitutional Council, and a lower house. The lower house elections couldn't be held without certain laws being passed and judicial review and so forth. But the upper house hadn't been dissolved, and about half of the upper house is appointed. So what Morsi decided was that he really needed a constitution that would allow him then to appoint the rest of the upper house, the Senate, and then he would have a president and a legislature, and then they could go forward. So he rushed through the Constitution. He had originally promised that the Constitution would be consensual. But all of a sudden he said, no, we'll have to take what we can get. So they had a draft of the Constitution which was disturbingly inflected with some elements of Salafism. So for instance, the Constitution sometimes talks about the implementation of Islamic law, because Islamic law is important in Egypt for personal status matters. This is true, religion plays this role in the United States. Marriages are done by churches often, and so forth. So marriage, divorce, burial, all those sorts of personal status matters, even inheritance often were done by religious rules. So the Constitution specifies that where there is any doubt as to what the Islamic law is in a particular instance, and where that Islamic law is mandated by Egyptian law, that then there should be a body that decides what Islamic law is. And the secular court judges are deemed insufficiently learned in the religious law to play that role. And so they said the Al-Azhar seminary, kind of the Vatican of the Sunni Muslim world, should now make a determination as to what Islamic law is, where there is any dispute in its application in Egypt. Well, this looked to the liberals and to the Coptic Christians like a big step towards Iran. You have clerics deciding what the law is in entire spheres of Egyptian life. And the Salafis were the ones who put in these provisions, although the Muslim Brotherhood had proposed them as early as 2007, even in the Mubarak era. And so the Coptic Christians and the left liberals were all very disturbed by this development, and the Salafis are working this provision, because Morsi announced that there would be a referendum on this constitution. It was held over 2 days, and it squeaked through. So that became the Egyptian constitution. Now the Salafis are saying Morsi is negotiating with the International Monetary Fund for an aid loan of $4.5 billion to Egypt. Egypt's foreign currency reserves are way down because of the lack of tourism and all of the trouble and so forth, and because Mubarak and his cronies seem to have looted the country of all of its money and stashed it away in various banks around the world under names that we still haven't ferreted out. So Egypt is in a bad way economically, so it wants the IMF loan. Well, the Salafis say, well, the IMF loan. What does loan seems to imply? Interest? And wouldn't that be usury under Islamic law? And if the president is going to make an agreement with a foreign body to engage in usury, wouldn't that touch Islamic law, and therefore ought not the clerics of Al-Azhar to intervene here to decide whether Morsi can accept the loan from the IMF. I know the IMF is not popular, that you guys have made demonstrations against it, and so forth, but to have the Muslim clerics of this seminary be the arbiters for Egypt's economic future is very disturbing. Of course, this is just an argument that the Salafis are making, and nobody's, least of all Morsi, is going to pay any attention to it. But it shows you the kind of juridical thinking that is emerging in Egypt and which is making the Copts upset. And the most recent thing that happened was very recently, in April, in a couple small towns in Delta Egypt, from Cairo towards the Mediterranean. The Nile it opens out. It has tributaries when it gets up towards the Mediterranean. It has made a delta. It's like Louisiana. And that delta is where most Egyptians live. And it's wonderful green farmland because it's fed by the Nile. It's unfortunately not going to be there very much longer. It's just about sea level. So if you get three-foot rise in sea level in this century, Egypt and Bangladesh are the two countries that could mostly disappear because of climate change. I suppose they should make friends with the Dutch. In any case, the Delta is dotted with these small farming villages, and again, there are these rural feuds between some of the Coptic Christian families who live there and Muslims, and then there's Salafi activity. Not entirely clear from the news reports what happened, but some kind of a clash got out of line. And some reports suggest that there were two Muslim factions fighting, maybe liberal Muslims and Salafis, and that the Salafis escalated the fight by going and putting graffiti on a church, and sort of saying the liberal Muslims are like Christians or something. Anyway, that went to actual fighting, and some Copts were killed in it, in the Delta. And so then the Copts in Cairo, and again in certain parts of Cairo like Alabasia, so those are where the attorneys and the professionals and the teachers and so forth live. They're upper middle class and they're very politically active. They made a big demonstration in their cathedral in Alabasia, demanding that the Morsi government, the Muslim Brotherhood president, do a better job at protecting the rights of Coptic Christians. And they don't trust Morsi even as much as they trusted the generals, which was not at all. So then they were attacked by thugs. They called them Baltagis in Egypt. It's not clear who these Baltagis are or who they're working for. So, some people will say the government sent them. Some people will say they're Salafis who took matters in their own hands. But in Cairo itself, the Copts were attacked. And this was a big incident. And, the Copts feel that you got a Muslim Brotherhood president, the military is still out there somewhere. You got this funny constitution that seems to be, Iranian in inspiration, and that the whole country is now going towards this kind of Muslim fundamentalism, and what does it mean for the future of the Copts? So there's a relatively new Coptic pope. They have their own pope. The Coptic Christians predominate in the Nile Valley, so there are a lot. Also, the Ethiopians are Copts. And they, initially in the medieval period, they belonged to a school of thought that there was all these disputes about the relationship of Jesus to God, of the Son to the Father. And the Western churches talked about, two natures, and the Egyptians solved it by saying there was one will between the two. So they were monothelites. So the Coptic, church has its own theology and its own liturgy and its own traditions, and it has a pope. So the pope, in recent years, has been pretty quiet and hasn't taken public stances on things. But this pope is a firecracker, and he came out after this happened in Alabasia, and he delivered a very stern reprimand to the president. It was a very interesting development. It's not the first time a pope has spoken out. Back in the 70s, Sadat sometimes was on the receiving end of this kind of thing. But it's unprecedented in recent times. So the thing I want to underline here, though, is I see evidence of Copts organizing, protesting, being courageous, just like the young people, the liberal young Muslims who took on the army. It's participating in politics, choosing political parties that they think will look out for their interests. And so for all of the uncertainties and the incidents which are very regrettable of persecution and so forth, the other part of this story is that the Copts are becoming part of Egyptian civil and political society in a way that they couldn't at a time when they were like a protected minority by the military government. And they didn't feel like they were very well protected in that period anyway. And I would make the same point about women and other groups who are very disturbed by the victory of Morsi as president and the Muslim Brotherhood ascendancy in Egyptian politics, which is that, you don't really get rights because the generals give them to you. And the Egyptian women who thought they were being given rights by the generals were living in a fool's paradise, in my view. And it was only most of those rights were things that mattered to upper middle class people anyway. Egyptian women will get rights because they organize and protest and do the things the suffragists did in the United States, not because the generals want to use them as kind of trophies in justifying their authoritarianism. So the same thing I would say about Copts and women and other groups is that I think the elections in Egypt have, on the whole and by and large, been fair. The first parliamentary elections, there were observers. I don't think they were unfair. The presidential election. The referendum for the Constitution we couldn't certify because it was done very quickly and it wasn't done under proper circumstances. But I don't think the outcome was fixed. And so if Copts want to play party politics, they want to choose a party and give it their support, if they want to choose a presidential candidate in the next presidential election and give him their support or her their support, they can now. And so I would argue that as a minority, they're better off politically in this kind of situation than they were in a dictatorship. How am I doing for time? 10 minutes? Okay. Well, very briefly then, I want to give you a second case, which is probably on your minds, which is Syria. I'm going backwards. I don't mean to go backwards. Let's turn to another, and he's comfortable with it. Turn to another case, which is Syria. And in the eastern part of the Arab world, unlike in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, where there are divisions among Muslims and so forth, but they're all Sunni Muslims, well, almost all. And then there are minorities like the Jews in Tunisia or the Coptic Christians in Egypt. But in the east of the Arab world, the Muslims themselves are very divided, and there are groups that we don't know exactly how to characterize. So there are Druze. Druze are wonderful people. I have many Druze friends, but it would take me a long time to explain what a Druze is. We historians think that they are originally a Shiite sectarian group. The mainstream Shiites would say a heresy of the medieval period, and they don't have mosques, and they believe in reincarnation. And they also are esoteric, so most of them don't know what they believe, and they're wise men who carry the tradition in their heads. So I can't go into that very much. But there are other things in the East, Ismailis, and and so forth. So it's not Egypt, it's just they're all Sunnis. But in the East, you have Shiites, you have Sunnis. I used to have to explain about those, but now I think most Americans have lived with this issue for long enough that I don't. But it's like Protestants and Catholics to some extent, and they have different ideas about what Islam is. Iraq is 60% Shiite. The rest are mostly Sunnis, but then the Sunnis are divided ethnically between the Kurds, who are not Arabs, and the Sunni Arabs. And because the Bush administration overthrew the secular government of Iraq, and I think without having really intended to, brought pro-Iranian Shiite forces to power, the region now is kind of choosing up sides along Sunni and Shia lines. I'm not saying that this in an essential way. It's a particular moment in which people are configuring their identities in these ways. And so you have the part of the Arab Spring happened in Bahrain, where you have a Shiite majority, but which is a functional minority. It's government, the 40% that is Sunni, supports the Sunni king, and the Shiites are largely second-class citizens. And then in Syria, you have a Ba'athist government. The Ba'ath Party is secular and socialist and all those 1940s kinds of things. It was invented by two medical graduate students at the American University in Beirut in the 40s, which, being a professor, I think it means their professors didn't give them enough homework. But it was a vision of Arab unity based on Arabness, and frankly has kind of 1940s fascist overtones. But it so happened, ironically, that as the Ba'ath Party in Syria developed, it became dominated by a minority. About 10% of Syrians belong to the Alawite Shiite branch of Islam. The Alawites are not like the Shiites in Iraq or like most of the Shiites in Iraq and Iran. They don't have ayatollahs, and they don't really have mosques, and they don't pray 5 times a day, and they're a little bit like the Druze in that respect. They're esoteric Shiites. They have beliefs that they don't share with you. And they're kind of New Age Shiites. And they have kind of a mythology. And so they joined the officer corps in disproportionate numbers, being rural and being a minority. And then when the military took over, it meant that they were in a good position to make a coup. And so they came to power in Syria. So Syria is ruled by the Ba'ath Party, and the Ba'ath Party is a one-party state. It has Sunnis in it, it has Alawites in it, it has lots of things in it. But the top echelons are Alawite Shiites, the minority. And so this is the opposite of Egypt, right, where the Coptic Christians are kind of the oppressed minority. In Syria, the minority is on top. And not only is the minority on top, and most of the officers in the officer corps are Alawite. Many of the really big businessmen, the billionaires, are Alawite. But over time in the 90s and the zeros, and this happened throughout the Arab world really, as you had public sectors being privatized under influence from the IMF and from Washington, there was an opportunity for these ruling groups to engage in insider trading because they owned half of the economy and they were privatizing it, so they knew where the good deals were. Politicians using their insider knowledge to engage in insider trading is something that would never happen here. But in Syria, it was really egregious. And so not only were the Alawis on top, but the ruling family, the al-Assad family, which was intermarried with some of the other Alawite families, so there were a set of clans around the president. They were the ones that became billionaires. They owned the credit card company, they owned the newspapers, they owned the shipping, they owned this, that, and the other thing. They invested in Beirut. And so, it would be I mean, a little bit like the Koch brothers and Donald Trump made a coup, and they were running the United States. Again, very implausible. There was this kind of Alawite, socialist, one-party state run by crony billionaires. And it wasn't a very good government in the past 10 years, and people minded. And then the drought hit, and the farmers couldn't get water, and there were a lot of discontents. And then the 2008 thing hit, and there was no money in investment, and they had bad relations with the United States. So people started protesting, and inspired by what happened in Egypt and Tunisia. But in Syria, the people who were protesting were youth, mainly Sunni, who are the majority. Sunni Arabs, probably about 65% of the population. But then you have Christians and Alawites and Druze, and you have Kurds, some of whom were not anti-regime, and so forth. So the Ba'ath regime didn't face a united opposition the way that Mubarak did. It faced a divided country. A lot of the Sunnis were unhappy with the regime, especially the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, but also Syrian youth and leftists and farmers and so forth. So initially, it was small towns and sort of medium-sized cities that joined this revolt, that joined the demonstration. Initially, it was peaceful. But the Ba'ath regime, not known for its tolerance, and had committed a major massacre in Hama in the early 80s. And so after a few months of these demonstrations, they just brought up the tanks and started firing into the people. And some proportion of the Syrians minded, receiving tank fire during the middle of their peaceful demonstrations, and decided that if the regime is going to treat them like this, then what you need is a rocket-propelled grenade to kill the tank. So the regime's crackdown militarized the opposition. And now this has been going on for 2 years. And the regime, is ruthless. It would bring up heavy artillery and bomb civilian neighborhoods where there were rebels or defectors. They've used fighter jets to bomb cities. They're doing to their own cities what the British and Americans did to Germany in World War II. I mean, the equivalent of the Dresden fire in this. They're doing this to themselves. I don't understand why you would do that to yourself. The regime is so insistent on retaining power that they're even willing to commit war crimes against humanity, to put down this rebellion. And as it has gone on, people have become more and more grim and less idealistic and more desperate, and they don't have enough food, and 2 million people have been made refugees. And then you want to see extremism. There are these guys who took up arms, and they started growing these really long beards and becoming more and more fanatical, and then they announced that they're the Nusra Front and that, by God, they're an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And this was not how this thing started, but it's how it's ending up, and they now control entire swaths of territory in northern Syria. This is very disturbing. You wouldn't want to see Al-Qaeda controlling Aleppo. And it made things worse for the opposition, too, because the opposition keeps going to France and Britain and America and saying, you need to intervene, you need to make a no-fly zone, you shouldn't be allowing the regime to bomb us this way, which is true. I mean, I think any regime that uses military weaponry against its own population, the international community should stop that. I know international intervention in domestic affairs of other countries is often very controversial, and people have a knee-jerk reaction against it. And I've written enormous numbers of articles against colonialism and that sort of thing. But where the United Nations and the international community can agree that there should be a no-fly zone, I think there should be a no-fly zone. But now, you know, the Obama administration would come back to these guys and say, well, if we flood Syria with weapons, wouldn't they go into the hands of this Al-Qaeda affiliate? And how long will it be till they use them on New York? And so it's an impossible situation that has developed. And there are three levels of paralysis. Syria internally is paralyzed because the country is just about evenly split between pro-regime and anti-regime elements. And while maybe now it's more like 60-40 or 70-30, still there are a lot of people in Damascus, even in Aleppo and elsewhere, Christians, Alawites, middle-class secular Sunnis who are afraid of these guys, afraid of the revolution, and not convinced that there would be democracy afterwards. They're afraid that it will be turned into Saudi Arabia. So that's one level of paralysis. And the officer corps is loyal to the regime. It's Alawite. Many of them are related to the president. And they're willing to use these military weapons against people. Then there's a second level of paralysis, which is that regionally there's a dispute over what Syria should look like. So Iran is supporting the Ba'athist government. And it's not because the Alawites are Shiites. The Alawite kind of Shiism is not liked in Iran. It's for geopolitical purposes. Iran doesn't have very many friends, and Syria is a land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is an Iranian client. So they're supporting the regime, whereas the Qataris and the Saudis, the Turks and the Jordanians, the Sunni powers, are supporting the rebels. But even some of the Sunni powers like Jordan and Saudi Arabia are now afraid of the Nusra Front because it's gone al-Qaeda. I know the idea of Wahhabi Saudis afraid of Islamic extremism may seem ironic, but that seems to be the case. The Saudis, by the way, have a story about how the Wahhabis, you know, are nice and reasonable, and it's the Muslim Brotherhood who are radical and causing all this trouble. There's that regional level of paralysis, and then at the international level, China and Russia claim Syria as a sphere of influence, and they block any United Nations authorization for the use of force in Syria, so there can't be a no-fly zone by the UNSC standards. And the United States has called for al-Assad to step down, but its official position is that there should be negotiations between the two sides. That's going to happen. And then the French and the British, as with Libya, would really like to get, you know, like weapons into the rebels. So there's this international paralysis, a regional paralysis, and there's in-country paralysis. And it's caused this thing to go on and on and on. A lot of people are afraid that, you know, the regime probably will fall in the end. It's not completely possible to know, of course, but if it does, I mean, won't there be massacres of the Alawite population? And wouldn't maybe many of the Christians also be in danger as collaborators and so forth? The polarization of Syria in this revolution and the fact that the minorities have stayed on the fence or supported the regime for the most part. There are exceptions, and there's some rebels from the Alawite side and so forth. It raises real concerns about the future of minorities in Syria. So here's two very different outcomes. You could hear that I was pushing back against a veil of tears narrative on Egypt, and I think the Copts are an awakening giant politically. I think they could be very important in Egypt, and they need just to get their political act together and push back. In Syria, I'm very pessimistic about the situation of minorities going forward, and I'll leave it there. Thank you. Well, I talked at you a lot, and it's a principle of public speaking that you get to talk to me. As was said, please ask questions, and in the interest of everybody getting a chance, I'll try and be concise in my answers, but please also ask relatively short questions. If you deeply disagreed with what I had to say, that's right, and you can press me on it, but please don't give the lecture again from the other point of view. So yes.
I think it was today, it was in the New York Times, that the United States acknowledged that Syria was using chemical weapons against its own people. Is that not so?
Well, of course, I have no way of knowing whether the Syrians have used, the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons. In March, there was an allegation by the opposition that the Syrians had deployed some kind of poison gas. They said, you know, the rebels suddenly started going into convulsions, and the physicians who treated them said it looked awfully suspicious and that it looked like gas. The head of Israeli military intelligence came out just a couple of days ago and said that he saw evidence of the use of sarin gas in this instance. I don't know how he knows. I mean, I know, you know, that the Israeli intelligence is very good, but they really have guys in Syria and those situations. I'm not sure, and I'm a little bit suspicious of that. But there are many of these reports, and the international consensus seems to be building that, yes, the regime did, on a limited basis. I mean, I hate to use a word like that. It's a crime against humanity to use sarin gas on people, but it also wasn't like Halabja where 5,000 people died. It was used in a battle to overwhelm these rebels. The issue of the use of gas is important because last December, the Obama administration, President Obama said that the use of poison gas would be a red line, that if the United States didn't want to get involved in Syria, I think Obama really, really, really doesn't want to get involved in Syria, but that if there were use of poison gas, something would have to be done. And I think Obama would say, if you pressed him on this, that we're monitoring the situation and seeing how much gas is used and whether the regime does something truly egregious. I really can't imagine that Obama wants to get involved militarily in Syria. I mean, he didn't even want to get involved in Libya. He was kind of dragged into it. I think he thinks that the Middle East is a quagmire. You know, no good deed goes unpunished. He helped Libya, and then they killed the ambassador, and wasn't the same people that he helped that killed the ambassador, but from his point of view, Iraq went bad. And, you know, Obama thinks, you know, he's from Hawaii. He thinks that the Pacific Rim is nice. And we do $1 trillion a year in trade with the Pacific Rim, and things seem to go well there. And, you know, when he goes there, people like him. And we only do $200 billion a year with the Middle East, and a lot of that is oil, which Obama thinks is, you know, not long for this world because he's going to go solar. So why get involved? So I think he's feeling some heat now because he made this red line and it seems to have been crossed. But I don't think that it's crossed in such a way as will force his hand. Yeah.
In the beginning of the American invasion in Iraq, there was evidence that the Syrian government sent some of the suicide bombers to Iraq to bomb places and start this Syrian war that happened in Iraq. And so now we're seeing that the same people that the Syrian regime used, they came against him and against the regime and trying to make the coup and whatever. But now also there's a new allegation that Qatar itself is, Qatar and Saudi Arabia is supporting these factions. What do you say about this? Are they, I mean, how can an Alawite use Salafis to go to Iraq and then they get their support from Qatar and Saudi Arabia?
Yeah. Well, with regard to the Iraq situation, it was the conviction of many U.S. Military analysts and of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki himself that some of the terrorism in Iraq was being conducted by groups who were put up to it by the Syrian Ba'athist regime, just because the Syrian Ba'athist regime didn't want an American supported neighbor. But you'll notice that Nouri al-Maliki is now supporting Bashar al-Assad. So there's been a 180-degree turn here on the Iraqi elite's point of view. They're more afraid of the Sunni rebels than they are, being Shiites, than they are of the al-Assad regime. So whereas every bombing in Baghdad 3 years ago would have been blamed by Maliki on al-Assad, now all of a sudden we think that 70% of the aid to the regime is coming through Iraq. So whatever that controversy was, it seems to be over with. With regard to the support for the rebels, these things are very murky, and I don't, pretend to have any special information. I was in Istanbul a couple of times last year, and I met with the Syrian opposition there. And I also met with some of the Syrian opposition in Paris when I was there this spring. So I can only tell you what people say. And I'm not on the phone with King Abdullah all that often. What the opposition is saying is this, that first of all, the Nusra Front is a tiny fringe. And most of the people fighting are just ordinary, everyday people. It's not al-Qaeda. That seems to be true, but less true every day. That is to say, the Nusra Front seems to be more and more important militarily in the north over time. They're the ones who have been taking the regime's military bases and then looting them for medium and heavy weaponry. I don't think it's a good sign when al-Qaeda bands are taking your military bases away from you. Wouldn't an army sort of try to stop that if it could? So it can't. With regard to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, again, here's what people like Burhan Ghalioun and others that I've talked to have said who are in the Syrian opposition, that nobody is supporting, no government is supporting the Nusra Front, the one that announced that it was an al-Qaeda affiliate. But, there are lots of Gulf millionaires and billionaires who've gotten rich off of the oil money, who are businessmen and civil society actors. They're not in government, and who are Salafis. Like the Kuwaiti parliament is dominated by those guys, and so is the Bahrain parliament. So they think it's from that level of Gulf fanatical Sunni business people that are sending money to groups like the Nusra Front, not the governments. And that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are both disturbed by the rise of the Nusra Front. In fact, Qatar just called on them to renounce this business about al-Qaeda. The Saudis are so, I was told, are so upset by the rise of Muslim radicalism in northern Syria that they've broken off support for the revolution altogether. They have withdrawn. And now there's some thinking that they're going to join with Jordan and try to give money to what are being called moderates in the south of Syria, near to Jordan, and try to help them to come to power so as to prevent the Nusra Front from coming to power. So the Saudis are being depicted by my sources as working with the Jordanians to promote moderation. But who knows? Yeah.
Could you explain how the Syrian government might fall? They seem so powerful militarily. How will they be overcome, do you think?
Well, there are tipping points. The same thing could have been said about the government of Muammar Gaddafi in August of 2011. In fact, William Hague, the defense minister in the UK, had given up on a victory, and he openly said that, maybe the rebels are just going to have to negotiate with Gaddafi, the same kind of thing Obama is saying now with Syria. And then it wasn't 3 weeks later, after Hague said that the Tripoli itself rose up and overthrew that regime. It wasn't in Libya. It wasn't the rebels coming in to the capital that ended it. The capital itself overthrew the regime. And I don't know whether there was more support for the revolution in Tripoli than we realized, and they gradually became less afraid as the NATO bombings depleted Gaddafi's arsenal, or whether they were being starved of goods and petroleum, and their businesses were suffering, and they just decided the only way we're going to have a normal life is to get rid of that man, whether you like him or not. So similar things could happen, and if Damascus rose up, then the regime would be toast. We historians think that the governments always like to keep the people in their capital happy, because they are in the capital physically, and their presidential palaces and their ministries and so forth are vulnerable to crowd action. If 500,000 people come at you, you can't take them out and shoot them. So the revolutions occur largely because the government in power has failed to keep the people in the capital happy. And so, that's how it would end, I think. Or one of the ways it could end would be if Damascus withdrew its support from the regime. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could help me fill in some blanks in the last part of the lecture on Syria specifically. In discussing the stakes for different actors in the regime change there and the revolution, Iran seems to have something at stake strategically. Turkey, France, China, Russia. But when it came to the United States, you seem to suggest that the primary concern is not having any good deed be punished. Could you instead maybe shed some light on the strategic interest of the American state from the point of view of the place where American economic or military interests are articulated?
Yeah. Well, what I'm trying to say is that as far as I can tell, President Obama does not think the U.S. has any vital strategic interest in Syria. It only had 400,000 barrels of oil a day. It's really nothing. And it's not a place where there's a lot of American investment or, economic interests. We don't do trade with Syria. From a Leninist point of view, if you wanted to have a Leninist theory of imperialism, what exactly is it in Syria that would draw the U.S. in? I don't see it. And I don't think Obama does either. I know in the Middle East it's widely thought that the United States is behind all of these revolutions. I'm not saying that you say that, but it is widely thought. And it's simply not true. I mean, the Americans were very, in love with Mubarak, and they wanted him to be there, and they wanted that government to survive. And you could see it when the revolution first started in Egypt. Hillary Clinton came out and said, "I'm sure the regime is stable." They brought Joe Biden on PBS, and Jim Lehrer asked him, about Mubarak being a dictator, and Joe said, I wouldn't call him a dictator. They didn't want this regime to fall. And while they didn't like the al-Assad regime in Syria, they had at certain times done business with it. Bush sent al-Qaeda people there in Damascus to be tortured at some points. And when Obama came in, he was determined to improve relations with al-Assad, and he sent Ambassador Ford there, reopened the embassy. I mean, from Obama's point of view, this was very unfortunate that things broke out in Syria, because he was working on a relationship here. Now all of this popular turmoil got in the way, and now there's these demands, the gas is being used, and that he get involved. And I'm telling you, Obama really, really doesn't want to get involved, precisely because he doesn't see a vital American interest here. Now, John McCain seems to see one, and there are American hawks and neoconservatives they say there are people in Washington who say, if only we could get rid of al-Assad, we would weaken Iran, and we would prevent rockets and materiel from being sent by Iran through Iraq and Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon. We could destroy Hezbollah by cutting off its source of war material, because the Israelis control the sea, they control the Beirut airport whenever they want to, so the only way Hezbollah can get resupplied is overland from Syria. If the regime fell and radical Sunnis came to power who didn't like Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has taken a stance against the revolution, then maybe Iran would be weakened and its reach in the Mediterranean would be cut off and so forth. So there are people in Washington who see a strategic interest in the United States in this revolution. But I don't think any of them are anywhere within 5 miles of the White House. Yeah.
Okay. Because I want to go back to a point that you made earlier in your talk about the fact about war crimes, and you seem like you had a pretty strong point about when you think that's occurring. We have there is a problem with interventionist tactics, but I'm wondering, because we're in this public space and we are talking about these issues, the problem with the United States is that it picks and chooses which Arab Spring it's going to draw attention to, while at the same time propping up regimes that are the Arab people themselves are trying to shake off that imperialistic nature that they've been living under. And so the United States seems to strategically pick whatever interests and imperial project they can keep on perpetuating. There are other Arab Springs that have been going on for years that we choose to ignore. And so I guess, and there are war crimes and there are chemicals. I will say it, there were chemicals used on the Gazan people in November of 2012, and we don't want to talk about that because we are allied with a very good strategic interest in a very specific place in the Middle East. And so I guess my point is, what do you think about the fact that we pick and choose, and we have been doing it for a long time, based upon what your comment was? Because, and we're orchestrating private military prisons in far places that have nothing to do with some of the places that were in war. Yeah. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about that. So we let states act with impunity in one place, and yet we are acting with impunity all over the place. And so I'm wondering what you think about that. Seems very problematic.
Well, it is problematic, and I think we have to, however, differentiate among the we's in your statement, because there's the we of the White House, and there's the we of the Congress, and there's we of think tanks and the Pentagon, and then there's we. There's civil society. And I think we have to push back against our government's acquiescence in war crimes. I don't expect the U.S. government to be a moral actor. I'm not completely in the realist camp, but the realists have a point, They say in Washington, you want a friend, buy a dog. So I don't expect the U.S. government to be friendly. But I do expect the U.S. government to be open to pressure. If enough people in the United States care about U.S. complicity in war crimes, then people can be punished in Washington and policy can be changed. It takes a long time sometimes, but I believe that the American people got us out of Iraq. I think in the 2006 midterms, the Republicans lost, which was a big shock for Bush and Rove, and they hadn't expected it. And the Democrats, once they were in, started passing resolutions to get out of Iraq. And then we put in Obama as a people, and he presided over a withdrawal from Iraq. And people say, well, he would have been all right if the Iraqis had wanted to keep 10,000 troops there. Well, it may be true, but the Iraqis, as we all know, did not want to keep 10,000 American troops on their soil, and they told Obama so, and it didn't happen. But none of this could have occurred if Bush had been succeeded by Cheney or McCain, and there's nothing wrong with McCain as a person, but I think his ideas of what American policy should have been in Iraq are not the same as the majority of the American people, which is why he was not president. So I think it is possible for us to change policy through political activism, and it is possible for us to monitor our government as to its actions overseas. But I don't start out thinking that the government is likely to be doing the right thing. I think it's going to follow its interests. So in the Arab Spring, as I said, that initially they supported Mubarak against these crowds, and King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and Bibi Netanyahu of Israel called Obama and said, don't throw Mubarak under the bus. And then when Mubarak was already mostly under the bus, then Obama helped him along. But it was a status quo thing, right? It was an adjustment to political reality. So it wasn't that they started out wanting to do the right thing. And I think this is true throughout I really think these events are being driven by the people. I don't think any international conspiracy is involved. There's international money sometimes which is affecting things. But I think those leftist young people made this revolution in Egypt, and it was similar kinds of people that made the one in Tunisia, and in Libya it was more complicated. There were both Muslim fundamentalist groups and leftists involved, but people kept asking me, who is behind these? And they're mass movements. Who's behind them? If you had a mass movement in Portland, who would be behind it? It would be you. It's not like there was one group, there was a conspiracy, there was a small faction. It was almost everybody at the end. So it's something that governments found very disturbing. I can't tell you how upset the Chinese are. And Putin, doesn't sleep in the same bed twice because of it. And he thinks that it's all a CIA plot and that they're gunning for him next. And then the United States wasn't very happy about it. But I think that these young people, this generation of Arab millennials, they're a new generation. They have new ideas. They have new ways of networking. And they're, by God, putting their imprint on the world. And so it's not coming from above. Everybody else is having to adjust to what they're doing. Well, I should take this one. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
The Russian and Chinese governments have stated reasons for opposing intervention in Syria. Do you think that those are genuine, or are there other reasons behind those being publicly stated?
They don't actually state their reasons for their position.
The principle of non-intervention in internal affairs of other countries, that sort of thing.
Yes, I somehow just don't think that the Russian Federation and the Chinese government have behaved that way in other such situations. I mean, I know they don't want people interfering in their domestic affairs, but the Russians have troops in Central Asia still. And so they call it the near abroad. So it's just not true that they're against foreign troops being in other countries and so forth. Now, some people think have proposed a Leninist kind of sort of economic explanation that the Russians do arms trade with Syria and they don't want to lose $4 billion of that. It's $4 billion over 20 years. It's not that much money. I mean, Russia is a gas and oil state. It doesn't need Syria that way. And they say, well, they gave them Tartus on the Mediterranean. It's the only warm water Russian port. But, Tartus doesn't amount to very much. So personally, I think what's going on is that between the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and about 2008, the United States was the sole superpower. It was a very unusual situation in world affairs because normally there are at least two major powers like the French and the British in the 18th century, or there are multiple centers of power as in mid-19th century Europe where you had Austria and Germany and France and Britain and so forth. So to have a unipolar world where there's one superpower, and it does whatever it wants, right? If it wants to invade Iraq, well, welcome to it. You notice that the Russians and the Chinese didn't say much about that. The French called the U.S. a hyperpower in this period. It's not a compliment. And I think by 2008, with the economic collapse and the quagmire in Iraq and Afghanistan, that it became clear that the U.S. couldn't sustain that role of hyperpower. And then Russia had fallen into deep economic and social problems. They lost 10 million people. It is bizarre. They were 150 million, they went to 140. It wasn't that they emigrated. And nobody was killed. They just had a reduction of population. It was because they stopped having kids. They were too up in the air to plan a family. So people died, but no new ones were coming along. So now Putin has reemerged and has kind of reasserted a central authority in Russia, maybe too much, but anyway, Russia's reemerging as not a broken country, as a power. And the Chinese, have been growing nearly 10% a year since 1982. And if you do that for a long time, you get to be a superpower. And so they're the world's second largest economy. They hadn't been very interested in projecting their economic power on a political, geostrategic basis until recently, but they've started to. So now they're making an aircraft carrier group. They're going to make another aircraft carrier. The Americans sent over a sharp note to Beijing, this, what do you want an aircraft carrier for? We have 11. So China is emerging. And I think what's going on here really is that we're going from a situation of hyperpower to a situation of a multipolar world in which there are multiple power centers. And Russia and China are using Syria to make the argument. We're now on the scene. We're great powers, and Syria is our sphere of influence. So we're back to the concert of Europe in the mid-19th century, when sphere of influence politics was how the international system worked. And it didn't work like that in 2003, which is why the Americans could go into Iraq. Yeah.
I'm curious if you might be able to, now that we've been discussing strategic interests in Syria with regards to the American-Israeli campaign against Hezbollah, would you be able to comment at all on the Burgas bombings and the recent Israeli report?
I'm sorry, on the which bombings?
The Burgas bombing?
There are so many bombings. I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
The bombing in Burgas in 2012, the Israeli intelligence services released.
In Bulgaria, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Bulgarians released a report essentially
Yes.
supporting Americans and Israelis that said immediately after the fact.
Yes.
And I'm curious if you might be able to comment on how that might affect the campaign essentially against Hezbollah.
Well, that Hezbollah engaged in a lot of terrorism in the 80s and 90s, including in Europe. And when the Israelis withdrew from Lebanon in 1999, there was a period in which Hezbollah kind of didn't know what it was for anymore. And that kind of activity seems to have largely tapered off. I mean, there were still border incidents and Hezbollah shelling of what they considered Israeli-occupied territory and so forth, but you didn't hear in 2000, 2001 about any Hezbollah operations in Europe. So it looked like maybe Hezbollah was becoming a party and not so much a terrorist group any longer. But then with the 2006 war with Israel and the American campaign against Iran and the killing of Iranian nuclear scientists by somebody, and so forth. We're in and then with the rise of the Syrian conflict, we're in a situation now where Hezbollah seems to be re-radicalizing. And I couldn't tell you that, Hassan Nasrallah picked up the phone and said, hey guys, go hit Bulgaria. It could be, Hezbollah has a lot of affiliates and a lot of cousins who decide to do things. It could be that they decided to do this and didn't have central operational control. But it's also possible that Hezbollah has just decided that the Israelis are deploying essentially terrorist tactics against Iran, that it's all right. Because, there's been bombings in southwest Iran near to Pakistan, which American intelligence has leaked. They think that Mossad is behind. Basically, Hezbollah may be re-radicalized in the service of hitting back against Israeli interests because they feel Israel is going too far in attacking inside Iran. I think the way this plays into Syria is only that it does strengthen the hand of the neoconservatives and the people who want a Western intervention in Syria because it's known that if the Ba'ath regime were overthrown, it would weaken Hezbollah. And so this is another argument for doing that so as to reduce this menace. I think Hezbollah, if it is actually conducting terrorist operations again on U.S. soil as it did 20 years ago, is being really, really stupid politically. Not to mention terroristic. Yeah.
Thank you. And I've been reading your posting and writings for the past 8-9 years, and I highly respect and
Thank you.
admire you. You have been always on the side of the people and the human rights. But then today, I would argue like the Arab Spring was supposed to be something to bring democracy and human rights for the Arab people. Of course, that's measured by the human rights of the minorities. So then I heard that you were saying, okay, for the courts, it's better to accept what's happening right now in Egypt, which is, of course, definitely better than having Iraq, there's total talk in the media about what's happening right now. I don't know whether you follow them or something or not, but there are fights between the government and protesters. Right now there are helicopters bombing protesters in Iraq.
In Iraq, you said? Yes, yes, yes.
So, what I'm saying is that the Arab Spring has been stalled. So, do you think that there is a chance to, and by the region is being divided between Sunnis and Shiites? They're all,
Yeah.
so, you know. Is there a chance for the Arab Spring to come back to the right track and restore the human rights?
Well, personally, I believe that human beings are free agents and they can do what they want. So if people deeply care about their rights and they fight hard for them, usually they can get them. Not always, but usually. I wasn't saying that the Copts should accept being second-class citizens, quite the opposite. I was saying that you now have a situation in Egypt, however parlous it might be, where the press is freer than it's ever been. Freer than it's ever been in history. There are still some limitations on the press, as Bassem Youssef is discovering, but those are shameful, and everybody knows that they're shameful, and I think they won't stand. So one of the Mubarak era tactics was they have political libel in Egypt. Political libel is a horrible institution. They have it in Britain as well. The United States got rid of it. But in political libel, if you say something mean about a politician, they can sue you, especially if, like, it wasn't true. You can't do that in the United States very easily because of our First Amendment. So friends of Mubarak, or people represented as friends of Mubarak, used to sue dissidents that they badmouthed the president unjustifiably. And now Mohamed Morsi's supporters are doing the same thing. They're suing journalists and others who critique Morsi or criticize him or caricature him. But just last week, Morsi rescinded all of those. He withdrew his support from the suits. So he knows it's shameful and it's seen as shameful. And it was because of the outcry of the Egyptian people over this tactic being continued, and they need to elect a parliament that will change the law so that political libel is gotten rid of. All that I was saying is that the Copts now have an opportunity for a normal political life. They have an opportunity to become a constituency of political parties who would like to be elected and would like to serve that constituency. And what we have found in American elections is that while it may be true that there might be Gulf money floating around Egypt buying votes, Saudis or Qataris or whatever it may be, we have found in the United States that being outspent by billionaires is not always effective. And so Obama was outspent by Romney and his supporters, and there were dark money PACs that we don't even know who they were who raised $1 billion to fight Obama. So I would say it was 3-1 and in the PAC world, not overall. But in any case, the Saudi money only speaks if people let it speak. And so I'm just saying is that what happened in 2011 and after was that the Arab youth overthrew shackles. And when you overthrow shackles, you have freedom of movement. Well, you know, you can fall down if you have freedom of movement, or you can stride forward. There's no guarantees. And I find it baffling that the Middle East is always treated as a special case. So they always have to be like, I don't know, poor cousins, or they can't quite get it right. So, for instance, in the Arab Spring, people were very enthusiastic here about Tahrir Square, and the youth in America were very enthusiastic. And the neocons were just furious because they never want a positive image of the Arabs to be common in the United States. And then when the Muslim fundamentalists won the Egyptian parliamentary elections, they said, you see, the Arab Spring was followed by the Islamic winter. Well, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood didn't win the elections in Libya, and the Nahda, the Muslim party, only got 40% of the seats in Tunisia. So is that really, you know, justified to look at it that way? In contrast, The revolutions in Eastern Europe that were kicked off in 1989 resulted in the following. Fairly good outcomes in Poland and the Czech Republic, although Czechoslovakia had a partition, which some people found wrenching. But Yugoslavia fell apart, and then there was a war, and there was genocide, and 400,000 Muslims were displaced, and people were put in mass graves. And then now Hungary is turning fascist, and Greece seems to be on the verge. So why is the Velvet Revolution not seen as having been followed by the fascist winter? You know, there weren't all good outcomes. There were some good outcomes, but and then Russia. Look, the Putin is the neo-authoritarians are back, and rock bands are being put in jail for staging a protest in a church and so forth. So nobody talks about, you know, how the East Bloc hopeful revolutions of 1989 through 91 have now gone bad. You know, those guys can just never get it right, the Slavs. But, you know, I'm caricaturing the way that the Arabs are talked about. So a revolution like it was 1989 or whether it's 2011 opens possibilities. And that's the good thing about a revolution. It also opens possibilities, which is the bad thing about a revolution. So how people manage their country and their politics and their future is up to them. And if they do it badly, you know, you get Greece or Hungary. And if you do it well, you get the Czech Republic or Poland. And I think that the Egyptians and the Tunisians and the Libyans have a pretty good chance of getting to a good place. I'm more pessimistic, as you can tell, about Syria. One more question. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to comment that you let the U.S. government off the hook too easily, and that and the fact that you think Obama really didn't want to get into Syria. I know the average American, after going through 2 wars and still fighting in Afghanistan, would want the U.S. to be involved yet again in Syria. But believe me, Saudi Arabia and Qatar would not have dared. They are so frightened of what the U.S. thinks of them and will allow them to do. It was when the U.S. gave permission for Saudi Arabia that they sent their troops across the bridge to Bahrain and put an end to the Bahraini Revolution, where the 5th Fleet is stationed. And it was with the wink from the U.S. that Qatar and Saudi Arabia went in with their Salafists to help Syria, because Israel was pushing the U.S. into a war with Iran. And I think that the U.S. was thinking maybe it would get Israel off its back if it can get rid of the influence of Syria with Hezbollah and so forth. So don't you think that there really is a lot more to the U.S. interest in Syria as a way of Syria being the soft belly to get through to Iran? Because Iran is still there. Israel is still pushing the U.S. to move against Iran.
Yeah, and the U.S. hasn't moved. Really, I'm a reality-based analyst. I was pilloried for this for years from the other side. And sometimes my analysis gets pilloried from the left as well because it's reality-based. I don't see any evidence for any of the things you said about Obama being true. First of all, it's not true that Obama can control Saudi Arabia or Qatar. Both of them have lots more money than Obama does. And they have a great deal of freedom of movement. And in fact, Qatar regularly defies Obama on all kinds of grounds. It has much better relations with China and Iran than the U.S. would prefer. And what Qatar does is play the powers off against one another. So it gave the U.S. the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, but then it'll do a deal with China or it'll deal with Iran at the same time. So the Qataris are multitask. But with regard to arms to Syria, the Obama administration has put its foot down at NATO with France and Britain repeatedly about sending arms into Syria. It has forbidden its close allies from doing so, even though when Sarkozy was in, he very much wanted to do that. And Cameron is inclined as well. And with regard to the Saudi and Qatari material that did come into northern Syria in late 2011 and through 2012, from what I don't have any special sources of knowledge about this, just what I read in the newspapers, but what the newspapers say is that Obama set up CIA stations and safe houses all along the Turkish border with Syria in Adana, the purpose of which was to prevent the Qataris and Saudis from sending in anything more than light weapons. So if the Qataris or Saudis tried to send in RPGs as opposed to Kalashnikovs, the CIA confiscated that stuff and stopped it from going in. And you could even make an argument that the U.S., by keeping medium and heavy weapons out of the hands of the rebels in northern Syria, has inevitably prolonged the war. But the evidence we have from the press reporting is that Obama did try to moderate the excesses of the Gulf nations in supplying arms into Syria. And we know that they have taken a very strong stand in NATO against military aid. And the United States itself has repeatedly, under Obama, refused to send military weaponry to the rebels in Syria. So I can only read the tea leaves that I see. And the tea leaves that I see are that Obama really doesn't want to get involved in Syria. And I know that he didn't want to get involved in Libya either. I know people like Sean Kay who were in the White House. He told me that on March 17th of 2011, the word in the White House to the staffers was we were not going to go into Libya. That was Obama's preference. And it was only when the Khamis brigades marched on Benghazi, there was a UN resolution that it looked like there might be a big massacre in the east, that Cameron and Sarkozy and the Saudis and everybody had been telling Obama, look, you know, you're going to be like Clinton in Rwanda. There's going to be a big massacre. You're going to regret this. And the allies, like Cameron and Sarkozy, were saying, we don't have precision missiles that we could take out the Libyan anti-aircraft batteries, which were quite good. If we try to put in a no-fly zone without American help, our planes are going to be shot out of the air. That the Americans have to come in to protect our planes. And Obama had spent the previous 2 years twisting Sarkozy's and Cameron's arms to stay in Afghanistan for an extra 2 years, which they didn't want to do, and he owed them. So that March 17th decision by March 19th had been reversed. But it wasn't Obama's desire. That was kind of an internal battle in his cabinet that he kind of lost. And I don't think he's very happy about having lost, and I don't think he's very happy about how Libya has turned out. So the idea that you could go to him now and say, we got to get involved in Syria, I just don't find it plausible. It's not how he talks. It's not how his national security advisor talks. And it's not evidenced from any of the reporting that has been done about U.S. Actions on the ground. Could things change? Yeah. And this sarin gas thing could push the Americans in this direction. But I don't start from an assumption. Obama, president of an imperialist country, therefore Obama wants intervention on an imperial basis everywhere in the world all the time. I start from an assumption that Obama is a rational actor. Yes, he's the president of a country that has an imperial tradition, but even imperial countries choose and pick where they put their resources. And it's not as if the U.S. has, as I said, a lot of interests in Syria, except that, as I said, the neocons would like to use it to hit Iran. Even on Iran, Obama keeps insisting that he wants to talk to Iran. He held P5+1 negotiations with Iran and Kazakhstan just last month, something the Bush administration steadfastly refused to do. He keeps kicking down the can, down the road on military strike, on Iran's nuclear facilities, and then he appointed Chuck Hagel as his Secretary of Defense. Chuck Hagel has gone hoarse in the last 10 years, saying it's useless to try to attack Iran, it won't have any effect, it's bad policy. If you go back and look at Hagel's YouTube appearances in the past 10 years, Obama was sending a signal with that appointment, and that's why the neocons in Congress punished Hagel so badly. So I just don't see any signs of an interventionist impulse in this particular instance. Thank you very much.